Welcome, Professor, for joining us a second time. Well, let's just jump into it. With the South Africa case brought to the International Court of Justice against Israel for genocide, what's your take on that? Is it convincing, or what? And what do you think of the defense presented by Israel?
Well, I listened to the South African case on Thursday as it was presented, pretty much from start to finish. And I thought the South Africans did an excellent job. It was done very professionally. And I found nothing in the presentation very surprising because they had issued an 84-page report beforehand that I had read. And the presentations, the various presentations made by the South Africans, corresponded quite closely with the 84-page statement. And I had not known what they were going to say based on any document because the Israelis did not provide a document beforehand. But nevertheless, I anticipated that what they would say would largely reflect their talking points over the past few months that we hear at great length in the West. And they did not disappoint me. So what the Israelis argued was not surprising for the most part, just like what the South Africans said was not surprising. So my view going in, which is that the Israelis are in the process of waging a genocide against the Palestinians, is the same view that I left the hearings with on Friday after hearing the Israelis talk.
Most of us are not lawyers, especially not international law specialists. But the ICJ case clearly has an impact on how the world, the global opinion, views Israel, the US-Israel relationship, and the Palestinian-Israelis conflict. What do you see are the implications for these three factors that, politically, the implications of that?
Well, I think for the Israelis, this is a disastrous situation because here you have a state, a Jewish state, and in light of the Holocaust, for that Jewish state to be accused of genocide is an absolutely terrible situation. And furthermore, when you look at the evidence that the South Africans brought forth on Thursday, it was massive. And in my opinion, it was compelling. And even if you don't believe it's genocide, it's at least mass murder. And I think this will be permanently a moral stain on Israel's reputation. And that's why the Israelis are fighting it so vigorously. For the Americans, the problem is that the Americans are basically complicitous in this genocide. The Americans are
The
involved.
weapons they supply.
Yes, not only the weapons, Alex, also the diplomatic support. The United States protects the Israelis at every turn on the diplomatic front, and of course, in terms of weaponry and in terms of economic assistance. So you can make the case that if the Israelis are guilty, we are complicitous. So this is a huge problem for us in terms of our moral reputation, but also in terms of our diplomacy. The United States has a deep-seated interest in having good relations with other countries around the world and having other countries think that, we play by the rules, we play fair and square and so forth and so on. And this certainly cuts at that. From the Palestinian point of view, I mean, they're simply desperate for help. Anything that they can get that will help them get out of this horrendous situation that they're in would be welcome. So I think the Palestinians are hoping that something good comes out of this, that it alleviates their suffering, at least somewhat.
Now, people always confuse the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, with the ICC, International Criminal Court, myself included, for a long time. Now, the ICJ is on state-to-state relationship, right? So no one, whatever the outcome, whatever the judgment at the end of the day, no one is going to jail. If anyone is going to jail, it will have to be the ICC. But the ICC seems to be taking a backseat, essentially going the way of the Western government, taking its time as opposed to the way it has issues always warned for Vladimir Putin over Ukraine. So is the ICC being negligent? Or what do you think? What's your take on the ICC as opposed to the ICJ?
Well, the ICC has not done anything at this point in time. Everything involves the ICJ. And as you said, when you talk about the International Court of Justice, you're talking about state-to-state relations. And this is really a case where South Africa brought a case against Israel on behalf of the Palestinians. And as you know, the Palestinians do not have a state on their own. So it really is the South Africans versus the Israelis. With regard to the ICC, nothing has happened, but it's too soon to tell whether anything will happen. I mean, the war started on October 7th, and today is January 15th. So things are moving along, but it may be the case that eventually people or individuals are charged via the ICC. But I think at this point in time, the really important question is what happens with the International Court of Justice.
What do you think? How do you think that the overall Palestinian-Israeli conflict will play out from here? Not just in terms of the ICJ, but at this point in time, where do you think it's going?
Well, I think the Israelis are in control of the occupied territories, and this includes the West Bank and Gaza. And the end result is that you have a greater Israel. And this greater Israel, which includes Israel before the 1967 war, plus Gaza, plus the West Bank, this greater Israel is an apartheid state. And the question moving forward is whether or not that will change. And I think that the only way it will change is if the Israelis are able to ethnically cleanse Gaza and ethnically cleanse the West Bank. The problem, Alex, from an Israeli point of view, is that you have roughly an equal number of Palestinians and Jews inside of Greater Israel. So there's no way you can have a democratic Greater Israel because it will eventually be a Palestinian state. And of course, the Israelis are adamantly opposed to giving up Gaza and the West Bank and creating a two-state solution. So you're left really with two alternatives. One is apartheid, which is what you now have, and two is ethnic cleansing, where you just push all the Palestinians or most of the Palestinians out of Gaza and then the West Bank. And if you look at what the Israelis are doing in Gaza since October 7th, it's quite clear that what they're doing is waging a punishment campaign against the civilian population that is designed to ethnically cleanse Gaza. And they've not been successful so far, although they've created a humanitarian disaster inside of Gaza. They have not yet been able to push the Palestinians out. I think that ultimately they will fail, and the end result is that moving forward, we will have an ugly apartheid state in Greater Israel, and we will have unending trouble. There is no end in sight for the trouble in Greater Israel, and in particular in Gaza.
Well, do you think it's possible that because of that, maybe in the near future, or maybe sometimes down the road, the U.S. will revise its no limits relationship with Israel? I mean, essentially, it's a no limits relationship as far as Washington is concerned, right? But at this point, seeing that's the ugly road, the future that they are looking at, I mean, at some point, Washington has to wake up. I mean, maybe before Israel was some sort of assets in the Middle East, it's now turning into a complete liability.
Yeah, there's no question that Israel is a liability for the United States. But I would point out that every president since Jimmy Carter has been interested in a two-state solution. Every president since Jimmy Carter, and this of course includes Jimmy Carter, has strongly believed that a greater Israel that was effectively an apartheid state was a disaster for Israel and it was a disaster for the United States. And presidents and their lieutenants pushed very hard to get a two-state solution. But it was impossible for them to put any meaningful pressure on Israel. And the main reason is that the power of the Israel lobby in the United States is so great that any time a president began to exercise coercive leverage with Israel, the lobby would move in and stop that president in his tracks. And the end result is that Israel was allowed to go on building this greater Israel. It was allowed to go on thinking that it could manage the problem in Gaza, that it could manage the problem in the West Bank. But eventually, it all blew up in Israel's face. And at this point in time, it's hard to imagine getting a two-state solution. I think that's out of the question. And this is why I said to you earlier, I think the two choices here are ethnic cleansing or apartheid. Two horrible choices, I might add.
Well, but okay, you wrote several controversial books, but your most controversial book is probably on the Jewish lobby in the U.S. Do you think, in light of what's happening now, do you think that the lobby could retain its influence, or do you think it might weaken? Because I saw one clip on YouTube where one of the senior lobbyists complained that the younger generations in America, like the TikTok generations, is turning away from the Israelis-American narrative. Some of them are becoming more pro-Palestinian, or see it from the point of view of the other side. So what do you think is the future of the lobby? Do you think it might be weakened?
Well, I think there's no question that the Israel lobby is mainly concerned not with public opinion in the United States, which is what you're describing, but they're mainly concerned with having significant influence with people in the White House and people in Congress. Those are the people who make policy. And the lobby concentrates most of its firepower on making sure those people remain firmly committed to supporting Israel unconditionally. In other words, no matter what Israel does, the lobby wants the White House and Congress to back Israel to the hilt. And the lobby is, I think it's fair to say, wildly successful at getting American policymakers, both on Capitol Hill and in the White House, not to challenge Israel in any meaningful way. Now, you point out quite correctly that if you look at public opinion, especially with regard to younger people, and especially with regard to the Democratic Party, you see a substantial and growing amount of dissatisfaction inside the body politic. The question is whether that dissatisfaction inside the body politic will have any effect on what American policymakers do. And there is no evidence of that at this point in time. And I believe over time, or let me put it slightly differently, I believe for the foreseeable future, the lobby will be able to sway the elites, the decision-making elites, in a way that forces them to give Israel unconditional support. So I don't think that change down below, at least in the foreseeable future, is going to have much effect up on top, which is what really matters.
So basically, the U.S. is committed to supporting either ethnic cleansing or apartheid, even if it's as clear as that, the choices. The Washington will do exactly that, commit to the same choices.
Yeah, the Americans will make it clear that they're opposed to ethnic cleansing for largely moral reasons. There may even be strategic reasons, but the Americans are not going to come out and say they support ethnic cleansing. But the question you have to ask yourself—
in practice, they would.
Yeah,
in practice, they would be doing exactly. Yeah, no one would say I'm carrying out ethnic cleansing, or I support ethnic cleansing, but that is what they will end up doing, even if they don't want to.
Yeah, I think that that's right. And I think that Netanyahu understands that. I think Netanyahu understands he can do pretty much anything he wants, and the Americans are not going to protest very much. And even if the Americans protest about ethnic cleansing, if the Israelis accomplish a major ethnic cleansing campaign in Gaza, what are we going to do? Are the Americans going to intervene and reverse it? I don't think so. Are we going to continue to support Israel, even though they ethnically cleansed Gaza? I think so. Do I regret this? Yes, I greatly regret it. But I think that when it comes to the U.S.-Israeli relationship, because of the power of the lobby, this is the way it works.
One last question. Um, since we're at the South China Morning Post, where do you think China plays in all this? Is there a role for China to play, or at the end of the day, it's a minor player?
Well, I think this is all wonderful news for China for a variety of reasons. First of all, it keeps the Americans pinned down in the Middle East.
Yeah.
What the Chinese now see is that the Americans are not only pinned down in Ukraine, they're pinned down in the Middle East, which makes it very difficult for the United States to concentrate on containing China. So this is really good news. Furthermore, this whole situation is doing damage to America's reputation around the world and making it harder for the United States to win friends and influence people. And this is to China's advantage. And furthermore, the Chinese are in a position where they can blame the Americans for the present crisis in Gaza because the Americans did not get a two-state solution. The United States failed to get a two-state solution, as I described to you before. And the Chinese can point that out, which they are doing. And the Chinese can say, we can solve the problem. And now what you see is that the Chinese are putting forward proposals to have an international conference to deal with this problem. And the Chinese look like the peacemakers. They look like they believe in diplomacy. While on the other hand, the United States is involved in a war where it's supporting genocide. This is a disaster for us, and it certainly works to China's advantage.
But presumably the war in Ukraine, as well as the siege in Gaza, they're not going to last too long, right? I mean, at some point, at least the intensity would die down. So eventually, maybe in a few months or in a year or two, can the U.S. refocus, we pivot to Asia and to contain China?
I think that there's no question that at some point in the not too distant future, which would include a year or two, that these wars are going to simmer down, both the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza. But I don't think they're going to go away. I mean, there's going to be trouble in Gaza for as far as the eye can see. And the United States is going to be fighting with the Israelis, although it'll be supporting the Israelis. We're going to have our disagreements. We're going to be deeply involved. We're going to argue with them about what the post-war settlement in Gaza should look like, and so forth and so on. So Gaza is not going away, and America's interest in Gaza is not going away. And with regard to Ukraine, there's no question that the Russians are doing much better on the battlefield. And I've argued, and I do believe it, that the Russians will ultimately win an ugly victory. But the United States will continue to support Ukraine, will continue to funnel weapons in there, will continue to talk about, bringing Ukraine into NATO. There's not going to be any peace agreement here. The best you can hope for is a cold peace. And if you get a cold peace, you can rest assured the Americans will have to pay great attention to Ukraine. So I think China's in excellent shape moving forward because the United States will remain deeply involved in both the Middle East and in Ukraine. And although it might not be as deeply involved 2 or 3 years from now as it is today, that doesn't mean it won't be involved in a serious way. And this is, in my opinion, not to America's advantage. As you know, I think the United States should focus laser-like on East Asia and pay as little attention as possible to both Europe and the Middle East. But that's not the way things are playing out. And again, that's good news for China.
Thank you so much for joining us again and for your valuable insights.
My pleasure, Alex. Thank you for having me on.